Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Let me start with the usual update on the COVID statistics. I can confirm that an additional 52 positive cases were confirmed yesterday. That represents 1.2% of people who were newly tested yesterday and takes the total number of cases in Scotland to 19,079. Now, a full health board breakdown, as you know, will be available later on, but I'll give you my provisional information. And that is that 27 of the 52 new cases are in the Grampian Health Board area. It's not yet clear how many are connected to the ongoing outbreak in Aberdeen, and I'll come back to that shortly. A further 13 of the cases being reported today are in the Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board area, and of course we'll be paying very close attention to them as well. A total of 269 patients are currently in hospital with confirmed COVID, which is 2 more than yesterday, and 3 people are in intensive care, which is the same number as yesterday. I'm also very pleased to say that yet again in the past 24 hours, no deaths were registered of patients who tested positive over the previous 28 days, and so the number of deaths under that measurement remains 2,491. Obviously, though, that total continues to bring home to all of us the impact that this virus has caused on families across the country and the grief it has resulted in too. So my condolences again go to everyone who has suffered loss. And as always, let me again thank everyone who is working hard in a variety of different ways to continue to help the country get through this difficult period. John Swinney, the Education Secretary, as you know, will give a statement to Parliament later this afternoon about this year's SQA exam results, so I'm not going to cover that subject in my remarks today. However, I will cover a couple of issues. Firstly, a brief update on the situation in Aberdeen, and then I'll have a word to say about today's employment figures. I've just mentioned that in the last 24 hours, 27 new cases were confirmed in the Grampian Health Board area. As of now, I can confirm that a total of 253 cases have been identified in Aberdeen since the 26th of July. 165 of these we think are associated with the same cluster linked to Aberdeen pubs, and in terms of the cluster, that is an increase of 8 since yesterday. So the rate of increase appears at this stage to be slowing down, but of course we remain very vigilant. A total of 875 contacts have now been identified from those 165 cases. Once again, it's important to stress that those 875 contacts might not equate exactly to 875 people. There's likely to be some overlap between different cases. The majority of the contacts have already been traced, and tracing procedures are in place for the others. And that reflects enormous credit on our Test and Protect teams. And I want again today to thank them for the huge amount of work. It is very intensive work, but very important work that they are doing to stem the outbreak. However, it is clear that despite all of their efforts, we are likely to identify new cases and new contacts for at least the next few days. Of course, the restrictions that were put in place in Aberdeen last week will be reviewed tomorrow, so I will say more tomorrow about whether they will remain in place for longer once we've been able to properly review the data and the other evidence and come to a conclusion. The other main issue I want to cover is the latest labour market statistics for Scotland, which were published this morning. They cover the period from April to June this year. They show that when compared to the 3 months from January to March, unemployment in Scotland increased by 11,000 to 124,000. The unemployment rate during this period increased from 4.1% to 4.5%, and the employment rate fell from 74.7% to 74.3%. Experimental figures for July also show that the number of people claiming unemployment-related benefits last month may have doubled since a year ago. These figures cover people who are receiving support because they're working reduced hours, as well as those who have been made unemployed. And all of these figures demonstrate again that despite the UK Government's job retention scheme and the support the Scottish Government is providing to business, all of which is very important, the public health crisis of COVID is creating a very significant economic crisis. The Scottish Government is determined to do everything we can to address that. We've already provided more than £2.3 billion of support for businesses. A major focus of our efforts has been and will continue to be for the foreseeable future to do everything we can to prevent youth unemployment. We know that youth unemployment can have a negative impact on people's lives for years to come, but we also know, and today's figures have confirmed this, that this pandemic is likely to lead to an increase in youth unemployment. That's why we have already committed to establishing a youth guarantee of opportunities for people aged 18 to 24, and Fiona Hislop will say more about that in Parliament tomorrow. We're also seeing a significant fall in the number of people who are taken on as modern apprentices. Figures from Skills Development Scotland today show a drop of almost 4/5 in the number of people who started modern apprenticeships between April and June of this year compared to the equivalent period last year. So today we are allocating an additional £10 million to help companies specifically recruit and retain apprentices. And that includes extra support for the Adopt an Apprentice programme. That scheme provides a financial incentive to businesses to employ an apprentice who's recently been made redundant, and it's therefore an important way of helping those apprentices back into employment. Now, today's additional investment on its own is, of course, relatively minor given the scale of the challenge we face, but it should be seen alongside wider Scottish Government and UK Government measures taken over the past few months. And of course, ultimately, and this is a point we shouldn't lose sight of, ultimately the best way of reducing the long-term economic impact of COVID and to provide a sustainable foundation for recovery is to continue to suppress the virus and then eliminate it so that we can all move to living in a less restricted way. However, today's measure provides a further demonstration, I hope, of our determination to support businesses and protect jobs, and particularly to protect young people from that scarring effect of youth unemployment. I hope it does provide some valuable help for employers to encourage them to take on an apprentice and get them back into work. The only other point I want to mention quickly before I close and hand over to Jason is that, of course, schools start to return from today, which is a very important milestone in our journey through this COVID crisis. Of course, most students will have their first day at school later on in the week, but I know today's milestone, while it will undoubtedly cause some anxiety for children and young people, parents and teachers, it is nevertheless a really welcome moment because we know the harm that has been and will continue to be done to young people's education and well-being the longer they are out of school. And today's return really has been made possible by the progress all of us have made in suppressing the virus. But we know from all sorts of evidence here at home and elsewhere across the UK and across Europe that progress remains fragile, and we all really need to continue to be vigilant and cautious. In particular, as the school term restarts, more parents and carers might be considering whether to go to the office rather than working from home. But I would encourage everybody to remember that if you can, and I know it's not always easy, but if you can work from home, you should still continue to work from home, because that remains the safest and best option for many employees. And we're similarly asking employers to keep non-essential offices and call centres closed for the time being. And more generally, as the Aberdeen outbreak has shown us, the virus is still out there, it is still very infectious, and it will spread if we give it the opportunity. So all of us, as we get out and about a bit more, need to continually check whether we are letting our guard down a bit more than we might have been a few weeks ago. All of us need to think about our own actions, particularly perhaps about physical distancing from other households. And we need to ensure in everything we do, because we should assume in everything we do, the virus is right there next to us, that we're not creating bridges for it to cross over and spread from one person to another or one household to another. The truth is, we can only continue to take further steps out of lockdown and make sure our schools stay open if we continue to suppress the virus. So let me end in my usual way with a reminder of the facts, rules that all of us must follow, and a plea to everybody every single day to remind yourself to follow all of these rules. Face coverings in enclosed spaces, avoid crowded places, clean your hands and hard surfaces regularly, 2 metre distancing is the overall rule, and remember to self-isolate and book a test if you have any symptoms. I say it every day, and I will keep saying it every day, because complying with these 5 rules remains the best possible way for all of us, individually and collectively, to keep this virus under control, and to keep that progress moving forward to getting our economy, our society and our lives generally back to as much normality as possible. So my thanks to everyone for listening. I'll hand over to Jason to say a few words before we take questions from the media.
Thank you, First Minister. And I want to simply expand on those 2 final points the First Minister made: the return of schooling and our facts campaign. So this week is a big week for thousands of children, young people, teachers and parents across Scotland as everyone starts to go back to school. Teachers mainly today, and then children starting tomorrow. Everyone in the education system, from local authorities, central government and to the teachers and staff themselves, have been working incredibly hard to put arrangements in place to support the safe return of children and young people. So as everyone starts to head back over the coming days, I'd like to take this chance to run through the 5 rules of facts and how they relate to that new school environment. So F for face coverings. Where adults cannot keep 2-metre distance and are interacting face-to-face for 50 minutes or more, face coverings should be worn by those adults. Any child or adult that has been advised or wants to wear a face covering will be supported to do so. And if you use public transport, not school transport, if you use public transport to get to and from school, then you must wear a face covering along with the rest of us. A, avoid crowded places. Adults in a school should continue to avoid crowded places as much as they can. So teachers and other staff should not be gathering together at less than 2 metres in communal areas such as staff rooms. Parents should not be gathering together in groups beyond what is allowed in the rules for outdoor meetings. If travelling to school on public transport, distancing and face coverings apply. C, clean your hands and surfaces regularly. We're encouraging schools to really focus on personal hygiene for pupils and staff. Children, young people and staff should clean their hands on a regular basis with soap and warm water or with hand sanitizer. This is particularly important when they arrive, leave, return from breaks, change rooms and at transitions. Arrangements should be in place to support very young children and those with complex needs who may need assistance. Children, young people and staff should be encouraged to observe cough and sneeze etiquette. 2-metre distance remains the rule. Wherever possible, teachers, staff and other adults should stay 2 metres away from each other and, as far as possible, and we understand the compromise, from children. Primary school children do not need to distance themselves from each other. In secondary schools, steps will be put in place to try to encourage children to physically distance as much as possible. Again, we understand the compromise. For example, there may be one-way systems in corridors. Classes might be reallocated in a slightly different numerical way. Schools will be doing everything they can to maintain physical distancing while making sure everyone can return to school full-time. And finally, S, self-isolate and book a test if you have symptoms. All 5 are important, but I think today, this one seems to me to be the most important. We need to try as far as we can to keep the virus out of our schools and early years centres. The whole school community should be super vigilant for the symptoms. All schools have in place plans to deal with positive cases or an outbreak. Health Protection Scotland will manage any school outbreaks through our Test and Protect system. It's vital that everyone continues to look out for symptoms of the virus: a new continuous cough, a fever, or a loss of or change in taste or smell. Anyone with symptoms or who has had contact with someone who has symptoms should not attend school. They will be asked to return home and be tested. nhsinform.scot to get your test. They should remain at home and everyone in the household should self-isolate until they receive their test results. If the test is negative, everyone in the household can stop isolating and the children and young people can return to school. If the test is positive, the person or child with the symptoms must isolate for 10 days and everyone else in the household for 14 days. Where children or young people need to self-isolate, their school will have plans in place to allow their learning to continue if they are well enough to do so. So as everyone starts to head back over the coming weeks, school staff across Scotland are genuinely looking forward, I hope, to welcoming children and young people back to school. And I know that children and young people are looking forward to being back. If you need more, then nhsinform.scot and parentclub.scot have all the information you need. First Minister.
Thanks very much, Jason. I'll go straight to questions now. First today is Chris McLaughlin from BBC Scotland.
Yeah, it's a question, First Minister, about football. Today we have had news of another breach of COVID-19 protocols within Scottish football. Given what's happened over the past week, do you regret now giving the go-ahead for football to resume when you did? And given the fact that fans have been looking forward to getting back into stadia in some capacity from September the 14th, has what has happened over the past week within Scottish football put that in jeopardy?
What I regret, Chris, is that some football players seem incapable of living up to their responsibilities. I very much regret that. When I stood here on Friday, I think my frustration about the Aberdeen Football Club situation was pretty palpable. One of the things we decided to do as a result of that, and I talked about this on Friday, was dispatch Jason to talk to all of the managers and all of the captains of our football clubs to reinforce the importance of the guidance that is in place. And while that meeting was taking place yesterday, the news came through of the Celtic player who had decided to go to Spain, come home and not quarantine and play part of a match, in other words, flagrantly breach the guidelines. This is just not acceptable. We're asking members of the public, every day I stand here and ask members of the public to make huge sacrifices in how they live their lives. And the vast majority of members of the public are doing that, and it's not easy. We can't have privileged football players just deciding that they're not going to bother. So this can't go on. What we're going to do about it? Well, let me say, first of all, I want to get to a situation here where clubs and players live up to their responsibilities, because I don't want the price of this to be paid by fans who want to watch football, even although they can't go as normal to spectate in stadiums. And I don't want the price of this to be paid by football players and clubs who are living up to their responsibilities. So there have been talks ongoing over the course of the morning. Jason has been part of those talks with the football authorities, where we've given them the opportunity to tell us how they are going to put their house in order and make sure that these breaches don't happen, or when they do, that there are very clear penalties in place for players and for clubs. We will hopefully say more about the outcome of those talks later on this afternoon. I don't want the season to be in jeopardy for the reasons I've just set out. I don't want people who are not responsible for this to pay the price. But we have to be very clear this situation is not acceptable. So we'll set out the conclusion of those talks hopefully later today. I think as a minimum, you should not be expecting to see Aberdeen or Celtic play over the course of the coming week. And we'll set out conclusions beyond that. Let me end before I ask if Jason wants to say anything else. Just, I suppose, by putting this as clearly as I can in language that the football world will understand. Consider today the yellow card. The next time it will be the red card, because you will leave us with absolutely no choice. Jason.
So, Chris, I think can probably imagine how I felt when I saw this story break yesterday. I spent with Mr Fitzpatrick, the Sports Minister, a lot of time yesterday getting all our ducks in a row to allow the Aberdeen game to go ahead and persuade the First Minister that that was the right thing to do. I spent 45 minutes with the captains and managers of our clubs. I'm a fan as well as the National Clinical Director, and that meeting went very well. I was given a good hearing. I didn't miss them, I think you can be assured. And I told them of their responsibility, but actually, more importantly than that, I told them of the dangers of the virus. They put at risk two things. They put at risk principally the health of the population, irrespective of if you're a footballer, a factory worker, a school teacher, or whoever you are. If you break the guidance, you put at risk your own health and the health of your loved ones. That's the most important thing for the footballers to understand. But they have an added responsibility because they put at risk the return of elite sport, not just their own sport, but golf, horse racing, rugby, swimming, everything else. We've designed a bubble system because they are privileged. They are getting to do extra things that the rest of the population aren't, and they have put that at risk. So I hope you can hear in my voice how disappointed I was yesterday to hear of another It's not just this one player. It's a series of breaches now that we have to get the SPFL and the SFA and the clubs to address. It's not my job to address them. I think our guidance and our rules are crystal clear, and they were made clear to them again last night. So I look forward to them coming with what that solution will be over the next week.
Thanks. Raman Bardwaj from STV.
Good afternoon, First Minister. Can I just pick you up in terms of point of clarity? Did you say there that Celtic and Aberdeen matches will not take place in the next week? Therefore, have you ordered the football authorities to postpone these games? And by postponing these games, what do you hope that achieves?
I don't order the football authorities to do anything. What we're trying to do here is get the football authorities to recognise and take seriously their responsibilities. And we have been having discussions this morning. Jason and Joe Fitzpatrick have been part of those. I've not been personally part of those. And I think given the circumstances, we still have an outbreak in Aberdeen apart from anything else. And given the circumstances around Celtic, I'm simply being clear, I wouldn't expect to see either team playing over the course of the week. We will be looking and have been looking this morning for other steps that the SPFL and the SFA are prepared to tell us they will take to make sure that football's house is put in order, and that players understand their responsibilities for all the reasons Jason has set out. This is about their own health and the health of the loved ones, but it's about the ability of their own sport and other elite sports to continue. And I think it's a responsibility they owe to their fans, not to put football in jeopardy. So footballers have to understand that. Clubs have to understand that. I appreciate that in both Aberdeen and this situation with Celtic, it's individual players who've made the wrong decisions. But football clubs have a responsibility, I think, to try to make sure their players don't make the wrong decisions. So we need to have an assurance that these things are going to be taken seriously. I don't want the football season to be in jeopardy. I want football to go ahead. I want fans to be able to, within all the restrictions we live in just now, to enjoy supporting their teams. It's fans that are being let down right now. So let's just be clear. I have a wider responsibility to the country. And, we've had lots of discussions over the months about, keeping the trust in the public message. I'm asking every day, I look down this camera every day and I ask people to hugely restrict how they live their lives. And people rightly will look to me and say, well, if footballers just get away with doing whatever they want, why do I have to keep doing these things? So this is about all of us. And I don't think it's too much to expect. I don't want to be pejorative about this, but well-rewarded footballers who are role models, and role models because they deserve to be. They are talented, skilled, hard-working professionals. They deserve that status they've got in our society. But I don't think it's too much to ask them to live up to that. And that is all we are asking. So let's hope that, as I said on Friday, but hopefully what will happen today is this is a turning point, and that yellow card never has to become a red card.
Come back in, if I may, First Minister. How receptive have the football authorities been to the suggested postponement of these games?
I'll ask Jason to say something there, because I've not been personally involved in these discussions this morning.
So, in general terms, not on the specifics, because I'm not going to give you the absolute specifics. We'll form all that as the day goes on, because postponements of games is only one element of the public health response here. We're looking for more enforcement and education, or an assessment that every single player in the league understands what this is, understands the nature of the virus, their personal responsibility, not just the club's responsibility for their individual behaviours. So that will become apparent as the day goes on, I hope, Raman. But the football authorities, you can be absolutely sure, this morning we've been on 2 long calls with them, Mr Fitzpatrick and I, and they took this very, very seriously. They did not come in any way try to defend either the individuals or the clubs. They, of course, have a different job to mine. They have a responsibility to the whole of Scottish football and those employed in those football clubs and the fans. So that's a slightly different role, but it was not in any way contentious or any way that they didn't suggest this was serious. Can I just say one other thing about the Celtic player in particular? Let's be clear, when the First Minister says that postponement is about public health, This young man went to Spain, to a high-risk country that we have assessed that you shouldn't then go about your business as normal, whether you're a shop worker, a factory worker, or a footballer, and went to work and put both his team and the opposing team at risk of catching coronavirus. Therefore, there has to be an implication of that in public health terms, not disciplinary terms, that's a different thing, in public health terms for those he was in contact with and their contact with others. So we have to, at public health level, take that seriously. If that had been me or the First Minister who had flown to Spain for 24 hours, then we would have to take that seriously.
Brian Swanson from Sky Sports News.
Foresee a day where the whole of the SPFL is suspended. Do you have a specific message to Bolingbola at Celtic? And looking at the wider culture within Scottish football, why do you think there is a culture from some to blatantly disregard your rules?
Well, I don't want to stand here and damn the whole of Scottish football on the actions of a minority, because we had several players, 8 players from Aberdeen last week, this one Celtic player. I hope this is not widespread. I have no evidence that it is, but equally I can't stand here right now and be sure that it is not. But I don't want to, you ask me, is the whole of the football season in jeopardy? I don't want it to be. I want it to continue. We thought long and hard about the arrangements that had to be in place to allow it to continue, because we understand the importance of football. Football is so important to Scotland's culture. People want to watch their teams. They want to support their teams. So we understand that, but there cannot be one rule for football players and other rules for everybody else. And this is not about picking on football. If it was rugby players or any other elite sport, we'd be taking the same pretty dim view of this. And it's not just about hitting people over the head. The consequences. Now, touch wood, the Celtic player doesn't have coronavirus, but we do know that 2 Aberdeen players ended up with it as a result of breaching the rules. So this is real consequences. And then if a player gets it because they've breached the rules, then the risk is to everybody around them. And suddenly there, whatever I'm saying or whatever Jason's saying, the risk to football is through the very real public health consequences of that. So this is just really important that people understand that none of these rules are in place right now for no reason. We don't want them to be in place. We don't want to have footballers or anybody else living under these restrictions. But when we're asking people to abide by these rules, it's because we know that failure to do so runs the real risk of the virus spreading, and then we all pay a price for that. So my message to all footballers is the same as the one on Friday, and I guess it's my message to all people who are being given the ability to play elite sport right now on strict conditions, is that you are role models. I think it is reasonable to expect you to live up to those responsibilities, but remember your status as role models mean that other people look to you and sometimes take a lead from how you behave. So you have that wider responsibility. So please, just remember that. And if you do, and if people abide by the rules, then football can continue, and people, albeit within a very restricted environment right now, can enjoy supporting their teams as everybody wants to do. Gregory Hoare from ITV Border.
Thank you, First Minister. On the exams, you've said that the SQA is not to blame, so ultimately you've taken responsibility on to your government and your ministers and ultimately to John Swinney. Does the situation make his position untenable? And if there is a no confidence vote in him, what will you do?
Look, we're focused on fixing the substantive issue. The politics will take care of themselves, and we'll cross the political bridges as and when we come to them. But right now we're focused on sorting the issue for young people, and I think that's the right focus and the right order of priority to have. John will set out how we're going to do that in his statement later on. And, call me old-fashioned, but when we get things wrong, and, I understand in politics people talk about fault and blame. We're in a very difficult situation right now where no decisions we are taking are easy, and there's no absolute easy or right, wrong, black and white. We're making difficult judgments right now. And when we get that wrong, I think it's better for ministers to stand up and say, OK, we accept that and we're going to fix it, rather than try to blame other people. So that's where I'm saying, call me old-fashioned, but actually accepting responsibility, but taking the responsibility then for fixing it, I think is what ministers should do. It's what I'm doing, it's what John is doing, and I think young people are actually much more interested in the substance of this than perhaps they are in some of the political narrative around it. Fraser Knight from Global.
First Minister, I would just like to touch on the return of schools briefly, if I may. Was wondering if you could set out the kind of protocol around a pupil testing positive for coronavirus at school. What happens then? Does the entire school get shut down? Does a class get sent home? What happens?
I'll hand over to Jason to give a bit more context there.
The most important thing that will happen is that individual, as we outlined at the beginning, would have to go home. Now, arrangements may have to be put in place for that to happen at a time that's appropriate. We wouldn't send people home without safeguarding. So each school has a plan in place for that eventuality. If they get symptomatic at school, they'd be tested, self-isolated, tested, and then Test and Protect would, if you'll forgive the expression, do its thing. It would examine where that individual had been, just as it would outside schooling. Now, that will be easier for older kids than younger kids. They will have to talk to teachers. They may have to talk to head teachers. They may even send health protection teams to examine the environment, as we've done with indoor hospitality. And those who require to be isolated will be isolated. That, I would hope, would not be a whole school unless there were an outbreak. But you could imagine a scenario where a group of friends who haven't been physically distanced would have to all self-isolate together in order to protect the school as a whole. So the outbreaks will be dealt with in schools just as they are dealt with elsewhere. And Test and Protect and health protection teams around the country are ready for exactly that.
When I visited West Calder High yesterday, they took me through the arrangements they would have in place if they had to isolate a pupil for any period of time because they were symptomatic. So all schools will have those arrangements in place. Fraser Nicholl from Original 106.
Thank you, First Minister. Good afternoon. On the Aberdeen outbreak, can you tell us what factors will be taken into account when deciding whether to extend or lift the lockdown restrictions in the city tomorrow?
There'll be a range of things Jason may want to add. That we will look at the overall number of cases, whether we think the chains of transmission are sufficiently broken that we are not at risk of seeing onward transmission, the rate of acceleration or deceleration of growth. I've said all along that we won't keep these arrangements in place for longer than necessary, but equally, having come this far, it would be a mistake to lift them just too soon. So we need to be sure that the outbreak is really under control, and that will be obviously a fine judgment that will be taken over the course of today and ultimately tomorrow.
So my advice will be relatively straightforward. The incident management team in Grampian and the health protection teams in the surrounding regions will inform that advice which Gregor and I will give to the First Minister, and it will be based on how well we have caught the chains of transmission. It will be as simple as that. You can see over the last few days a kind of slowing of the numbers, but they're not coming down yet. We're not back to normal. So this virus is still spreading within a community that relates back to those initial examples nearly 2 weeks ago now. So I am encouraged by what is happening. It is working how we predicted it would work. So the Aberdeen semi-lockdown is doing what we expected. But remember, the virus doesn't work in 24-hour chunks. It works in 7 and 14-day chunks, more likely. So we're not yet over that hump completely. And I cannot, with any real authority, say that we have reached the end of every chain of this transmission. So our advice will be based on exactly that.
Thanks, Lindsay Hanna from Bauer.
Thanks, First Minister. Just back on what you were saying about football earlier on, Radio Clyde's heard from the Motherwell manager this morning who said, don't punish the whole industry, punish the individuals. What would you say to that? And just a question for Jason Leitch as well, if you don't mind. You spoke with managers and captains only yesterday. Are you still confident that they understand the severity of the situation?
I would agree. I didn't catch whether it was the Motherwell manager or somebody else from Motherwell that had made that comment, but I would broadly agree with that. We shouldn't be making those who are abiding by the rules pay the price for those who aren't. But I think there's a collective responsibility on football as well, and hopefully some of the clubs that are abiding and players that are abiding will also apply a bit of pressure to those that might not be, so that collectively football can make sure its house is in order. So we want to be proportionate about this. We don't want to have a sledgehammer, but equally, you know, the public would, I think, take a dim view of me standing up here every day sort of lecturing them about the do's and don'ts of suppressing coronavirus while continuing to kind of just allow football to abide by or not abide by the rules whenever it sees fit. So that situation can't go on. So, you know, football has to get its house in order. And otherwise it is the people who don't deserve it that end up paying for this. So let's try and hold back from that. Jason?
I think I have a gradient of confidence. So I'm very confident that the SPFL and the SFA understand the seriousness of what has happened and what has to happen next. I have some confidence in the managers and the captains. You'd have to ask them if my communication skills got that through to them yesterday. The feedback from that is that it did, and a lot of them perhaps had a bit of a wake-up call to the seriousness of this virus globally and the fact it can kill people locally. I have less confidence in the individual player behaviour. You won't be surprised to know that's the piece I have less confidence in. So over the next few days, I hope to regain confidence in individual player behaviour. And that's the bit that we require in addition to the clubs and the regulatory bodies.
Neil Pooran from PA.
Thanks, First Minister. On football, if I can ask how close you are to using the red cards that you mentioned earlier, what would it take for you to cancel the return of professional football altogether? And could just one more breach lead to that situation coming about?
I'd rather focus on trying to persuade football players not to get into this position. Let's make sure, I better not go too far into my footballing language or I'll probably run into trouble here. But, you know, if I can use the referee analogy, let's make sure that the red card stays in the pocket. And that comes down to, it's a bit like just now, every day when I talk about, it's down to all of us to keep the virus under control so we don't have to go back into lockdown or, you know, have restrictions in place longer than necessary. Well, the same's true of football. It's down to, ultimately not me, it's down to individual football players to decide whether it means enough to them to keep playing football this season that they don't go to Spain for however long and come back and put everybody at risk, and they don't go for a meal on a Saturday night in a city centre restaurant, because actually as professional footballers, they understand their responsibility to the public health of the country, they understand their status as role models to their fan base, but also that they actually want to keep playing football, which I imagine for every football player is kind of top of their list of priorities. They want to be on the pitch playing. So much of this for all of us just comes down to individual responsibility, and that's as true of footballers as it is of any of us. So, you know, let's try and make sure and hope that this, in a way that, you know, maybe we didn't get through sufficiently with the Aberdeen situation, that this finally gets that message across, that you're only hurting yourselves well, that's not true, actually. You're potentially hurting everybody if you don't abide by the rules, but you're also hurting yourselves because you may end up not being able to play professional football. So I hope the red card never has to come out, because we'd all lose if that ended up being the situation. Do you want to add?
Only how fragile it is. I wouldn't be surprised if we get social media pictures of breaches in the past now, and people go looking for other. From now, if there are breaches from now, it's going to be very, very hard for the advisors to say to the First Minister that we have confidence in the sport bubbles. That's going to be extremely difficult for me to say to the First Minister and the Cabinet that I continue to have confidence in the Scottish football sports bubbles. So breaches from now feel to me like a big, big risk.
Can I just make one more point here? It's a point I think I made on Friday. There will be people in the country, including potentially footballers, who get this virus regardless of doing everything right and trying their very hardest to abide by the rules, unfortunately, none of us can guarantee that in spite of our best efforts, we don't get the virus. And if that happens to a footballer, you know, they will deserve nothing but sympathy. What we're talking about here are clear, blatant breaches of the rules, and that is what can't go on. And I agree with Jason, let's take this as a line in the sand. From now on, if there are repeats of this kind of breaching behaviour, then there comes a point where we can't just allow football to continue. But let's hope it doesn't get to that. Scott McNabb from the Scotsman.
Thank you, First Minister. On the jobs figures which came out today, you referred to the fact that it's a looming economic crisis. Professor David Blanchflower told the Economy Committee this morning that it's a looming disaster for young people and we should throw the kitchen sink at it to try and save their future prospects. One thing he suggested is that with the absence of overseas students coming to Scottish universities this year, we effectively open up the places to Scottish students. He suggested everyone who applies should just get in. Is that something you would consider? And also, can you tell us when your jobs guarantee that you've pledged to introduce will be implemented?
Fiona Hislop's going to say more about the jobs guarantee very soon in Parliament, and I'll leave her to do that. But you know, we are anxious to get that up and running as quickly as possible because we know the impact economically, but also, as I said earlier on, the disproportionate impact that this economic crisis can have on young people. In terms of university places, there may be a bit of read through from John Swinney's statement this afternoon to university places, so I'm not saying much more about that right now. But of course, we want to make sure there is every opportunity possible for young people, given what lies ahead of us, and we are very focused on that. And I should say, you know, we've gone now through half of the list of questions here, and at last, you know, we're addressing, this is not a criticism of journalists, by the way, but at last we're addressing a real question about the economic impact of this virus. And it just underlines another point, that every minute of the day that I or Jason or anybody else has to spend, you know, dealing with the impact of footballers not following the rules is a minute we're not spending on this stuff. So it's another reason why we need to see everybody abide by these rules. Christine Lavelle from The Sun.
Thank you, First Minister. It was just on football, just on a point of clarity. You've said a few times that next time will be a red card situation. Does that mean the suspension of all professional football? And just additionally on the exam results, what would it take for John Swinney to get a red card?
Look, on the exam results, we are setting out how we're going to sort it for young people. And I think that's, if my inbox is anything to go by, that's what young people want to see. The politics of it, you know, we'll deal with as and when we have to deal with it. But my focus is on the substantive solution. And yeah, the suspension of football, if people continue to breach the rules, can't be ruled out. But I don't want that to happen. I really don't want that to happen. So the solution lies in the hands of footballers and football clubs. Derek Healy from the Courier.
Thank you, First Minister. There have been reports today that Boris Johnson blocked a proposal for the UK government to invite you and the leaders of other devolved administrations to cabinet meetings. Given you've spoken before about the importance of four-nation decision-making during the pandemic, do you think it would have been valuable to attend those cabinet meetings, particularly over the last few months when dealing with this crisis?
I don't know whether that proposal is accurate or not. I think certainly there is a value to good quality Four Nations discussions, and we've had some of them. We have had periods during this crisis where perhaps it hasn't worked as well as it should have done. But whether that is about me or Mark Drakeford or Arlene Foster attending UK cabinet meetings where clearly we couldn't be bound by overall collective responsibility because we're not part of those governments, or whether it is having COBRA meetings or the kind of four-nation calls that we've been having more recently, I'm less bothered about the form and more bothered about having discussions that are meaningful, where we genuinely listen to each other, respect each other's views, try to come to common ways forward. And there's been some very good examples of that in recent times. So I think it's probably better to focus on, again, the substance rather than the form. And I'll probably just leave it at that. Mark McLaughlin from The Times.
Good afternoon, First Minister, Professor Leitch. This may be one for Professor Leitch. I understand that not all of the contacts in the Aberdeen cluster were tested. Whenever we ask about kind of routine testing, the answer that we get is that it doesn't change the guidance in any way, that these people would still be told to isolate. Now, if you look at the footballers, they were given guidance and they defied your guidance. So I suppose the question would be, are you more likely to follow the guidance if you receive a positive test to stay home than you would be to be dissuaded from that if you get a negative test? And I also notice as well that there's another study from Hong Kong looking at South Korea that says something like 20% or 30% of asymptomatic people who were tested positive. So there is asymptomatic tests can be done, and it could have a behavioural effect. So I just wanted to get your views on that.
I think there's a balance between how you use that testing, and just now we are leaving it to health protection teams locally to decide when they should do the testing. So in Dumfries and Galloway, in the outbreak from a few weeks ago, we tested contacts. We tested in even broader than that. We went to workplaces and tested asymptomatic people in those workplaces, just to make sure we were reaching the end of the viral transmission. So Grampian have exactly that same purpose available to them if they require it. Just now they are testing some because they are worried about some places if there are positives, and they're making a decision to isolate the contacts. Remember that the test doesn't change the isolation. The test is only to confirm where the virus is. You still have to isolate. Asymptomatic spread, you're right, Mark, the science of that is changing all the time. We now think probably globally the consensus appears to be that you spread the virus pre-symptomatically for a couple of days, probably not quite as dramatically as you do when you have symptoms. That would make physical sense because you cough and splutter more when you have the symptoms. But true asymptomatic is harder to find. There are some, but they don't appear to spread it to the same extent as the pre-symptomatic and the symptomatic group. So our testing strategy changes a lot along with that science, and we're not done. We will almost certainly change it again.
Thanks. Rachel Watson from the Daily Mail.
Thank you, First Minister. I just wanted to go back to football. And earlier you said that footballers are role models, especially for children and young people. I wondered, how concerned are you about the behaviour of footballers and how that might rub off on other people in society? If they see footballers breaking the rules, are they likely to follow the same path? And also, you spoke earlier about penalties in relation to footballers. Can you give us a little bit more detail on that? Does that mean penalties against individual players, for example, or will that be against clubs? And who decides that?
I'm not able to give you more detail about that. That will flow from the discussions that have been had this morning, and ultimately it's for the football authorities to apply penalties, not for the Scottish Government. So we look to them to make sure that there's the right system in place to encourage the right behaviour and guard against the wrong behaviour. But ultimately, I think personal responsibility in the context of the crisis we're living through is probably the thing we want to encourage most in footballers. I'm not going to repeat myself. I've probably never talked as much about football in my life as I have over the last few days, all at one time. But, you know, I'm not going to repeat myself, but footballers are role models, and therefore there is always that added sense of responsibility that people, fans, maybe younger people in particular, look to you to take a lead. Now, that's not to say every football fan is going to breach the rules because a football player does, but just be mindful of that responsibility. And it's one you've earned because of your hard work and your talent and your skill. So live up to it with pride. It would be what I would say to footballers. Tom Martin from the Daily Express.
Hi, thank you, First Minister. Again, I know you're probably sick of talking about it, but just going back to the issue of footballers. Professor Leitch mentioned in an earlier answer he had less confidence in players' abilities and coaches' abilities to follow these rules. Is it a case of arrogance or ignorance being to blame for these serial breaches we're now seeing? And briefly, if I may, just on the Aberdeen cluster, Is there any evidence yet of wider spread into beyond into Aberdeenshire, and what implications does that have for the measures in place?
The Aberdeenshire situation has been monitored very closely, and obviously, also potential spread even on a small scale into other parts of Scotland is something that has been looked at carefully as well. And I can't say more because I don't have more of the detail in front of me around that right now. On the question about football, I don't know what the motivation is. I can't see inside the heads of footballers, but what I would say is I always accept that these rules can be complicated, they can be difficult. So I've always accepted that some people who breach the rules, all of us are capable of breaching these rules accidentally or because, we forget. None of us are perfect, and I really don't want to suggest that every time somebody breaches one of these rules, it means they're a bad person, because I don't believe that. But in terms of some of the bigger, ticket rules here, not going to Spain without quarantining when you come home. I don't know, can there be many people in the country that don't know that's the rule right now? I'm not sure. And perhaps football clubs should make sure that if there is anybody in the country that doesn't know that's a rule, their players are not amongst those people. And similarly, going out to a restaurant in a big group that breaches the number of households that are meant to gather inside, again, yes, I get that maybe some of these rules are complicated and they get more complicated. But again, footballers in particular, for all the reasons we've talked about, should maybe just make sure they check what the rules are and therefore don't fall into the position of inadvertently breaching them. So just make sure. All of us should be familiarising ourselves with the rules right now, but particularly people who are being given privileged positions, which footballers are, to play their sport right now, should make sure that they are in no doubt about the rules that they're meant to follow. Dan Sanderson from The Telegraph.
Thanks very much, First Minister. Just back on the SQA results, you said last Wednesday, we want employers to look at the 2020 results and not think they're not valid. We want there to be a credibility about them. I don't want employers to write off 2020 results because they just assume everybody was awarded a higher grade. Totally appreciate the points you've made that this was a very difficult issue. There would be controversy, whatever you did. But given this is a danger you've flagged up yourself, do you have any thoughts on how you ensure that the 2020 results in future years aren't looked on less favourably by employers? And isn't there a danger in fixing one problem, you're just creating a potentially more long-term problem for these kids?
Well, welcome to the reality of governance, which you always face these dilemmas. These decisions, particularly in a time of crisis, are not easy, and I think it's important. That's not to make anybody feel sympathy, or I'm in the privileged position of being trusted with these decisions, so it's our job to get them as right as we can, and we don't get them right to try to make sure that we put them right in future. The issue that I articulated last week, doesn't just go away, but I would make 2 points. One I made yesterday, and another point, well, maybe 3 brief points. One, that concern that I articulated last week has been, I suppose, outweighed in my mind in the days that have passed since by this sense that I spoke about yesterday of having some young people, particularly young people from working class backgrounds, thinking that the system is stacked against them no matter how hard they work at school. And that for me is a bigger issue now, and I don't want that to be the case. Secondly, maybe we just need to see 2020 being more unique and just accept that it is unique. Hopefully by the exam diet next year we'll be out of this, and this year will be truly unique. And if it is the case that some young people's teacher estimates are above what statistically they would have been predicted to get in an exam, not individually but statistically, then when you weigh that against the enormous disadvantage that young people have been served up as a result of COVID, then maybe we're just balancing that out a little bit. So there are wider considerations that we have to take into account, but I'm not going to say more than that because the Deputy First Minister will set it out to Parliament later on. And lastly today, Helen McCardle from The Herald.
Afternoon, First Minister. I just wanted to ask a couple of more health-related questions. There's reports today that research carried out by Public Health England has found that older pupils in secondary school can spread the virus as easily as adults, and a rapid review of that research has been ordered, apparently. So I wondered if anyone from the Scottish Government team had seen that evidence and what you could say about it. And also just a quick question on NHS Lothian hospital admissions. In the past 2 weeks, between July the 28th and yesterday, the number of people in hospital with COVID in the Lothian area increased by 12 from 67 to 79. That's not a pattern that's been seen in any other health board area at the moment, including Greater Glasgow and Clyde and Grampian. So I wondered, is that something that's been looked at, and do we know what's going on there?
I'll hand over to Jason in a second on both those points. Suffice to say, we look very carefully at all of this data on a daily basis and try to understand if there are any patterns that we need to be aware of. And you know, the hospitalisation data we look at as closely as we do the new case data. On evidence, we will continue to look at new evidence as it emerges and as it appears. And if at any stage new evidence suggests to us that we should be changing our position on any aspect of dealing with this virus, we will do that, and that will apply to the situation around schools as it does more generally. But the position that has led to the guidance that supports the reopening of schools has been informed by our scientific advisors, who have looked carefully at all of the evidence that they had access to at that time. Jason.
To your first point, the Public Health England evidence is unpublished. All I've read is newspaper articles about it in contrasting newspapers, frankly. I'm not surprised by what I've read. There is a gradient of transmission as you age. We know that from around the world. There isn't a sudden cut-off that says 5-year-olds transmit it, don't transmit it, and 17-year-olds do. There is a gradient. There is also a risk to the disease that is also a gradient, but goes much higher as you get much older, long after school age. So I am not surprised, and you can see in our guidance that we're being slightly more cautious about older children than we are about younger children, and that's for that reason. Remember, the other reason we have advised it is safe for schools to open is because the prevalence of the virus is so low. Our advice was to close schools when the prevalence was high. So that's the other point. It's not just transmission, it's the amount of virus that is available to be transmitted in the whole population. The NHS Lothian data, I will look and I will talk to NHS Lothian about it specifically. My immediate instinct is that the hospitalisation relates often to severity of disease, not to number of infections. So it may be that in Lothian, it is older patients who have had the positive tests, and therefore they have had a sicker journey than those in other areas that perhaps have been infected and younger. And you can see in Grampian, we haven't seen perhaps the expected number of hospital admissions for the Grampian numbers because it is mainly in young people.
Jason, thank you. That concludes the questions for today. My thanks to all of the journalists who joined us. My thanks to Jason for helping me answer the questions, and to Anna, our BSL interpreter, for the day. Thanks to all of you for joining us. I will join you tomorrow from the Scottish Parliament, where I'll give the update for the day, including our conclusion on the Aberdeen restrictions, and then take a session of First Minister's questions, where the opposition leaders, as opposed to the journalists, will be posing the questions. And I'll be back here at 12:15 on Thursday, hopefully talking about something other than football. But in the meantime, please abide by the facts. Advice is really, really important and helps all of us keep this virus under control. So remember, face coverings in enclosed spaces. Avoid crowded places, indoors or outdoors. Clean your hands regularly. Clean hard surfaces regularly. Keep a 2-metre distance as the overall rule, and self-isolate and book a test if you have symptoms. If we all do that, then we can all help keep COVID under control. My thanks for joining us just now, and I will see you from a different venue tomorrow.